They expected silence when the Varendian ambassador insulted Duke Ashford in a language no one at court understood. What they did not expect was the lowly Maid stepping forward and answering in that same tone, her voice steady as steel, her words cutting deeper than any blade. In that single moment, every assumption about power, worth, and station shattered like crystal against stone. The evening had begun with all the calculated precision of a diplomatic dance. The Duke's estate gleamed under candlelight, every surface polished to mirror brightness, every servant trained into near invisibility. Duke Marcus Ashford stood at the center of it all, a man whose reputation had been built on restraint so absolute it unnerved even his allies. At 32, he had inherited a duchy in chaos and forged it into something formidable through sheer force of control. Ambassador Varen arrived like a storm dressed in silk. Where the Duke was stillness, Varen was motion, expressive, loud, theatrical. His country sought trade agreements that would benefit both nations, but watching him work the room, it became clear he intended to secure advantage through intimidation rather than negotiation. At first, his provocations were subtle, compliments with edges sharp enough to draw blood if one listened carefully, laughter that mocked under the guise of charm. The Duke met each thrust with practiced calm, his expression revealing nothing. Then, midway through dinner, Varen shifted tactics entirely. He abandoned the common tongue and slipped into Varendian, his native language. Not quietly. He spoke at full volume, as though sharing an amusing observation. But the words themselves were poison. He questioned the Duke's competence, mocked his careful diplomacy as weakness, suggested that a man who spoke so little must think even less. A few guests stiffened, those who recognized the language if not the specific insults. But most continued eating, assuming polite conversation flowed around them as always. The Duke's jaw tightened fractionally, the only sign he understood perfectly. But he did not respond, did not even look up from his plate. Varen smiled wider, emboldened by the silence, and continued. His insults grew sharper, more personal. He implied the Duke's authority was borrowed rather than earned, that his careful control masked incompetence, that Varen himself could have dismantled the duchy's defenses with barely an effort. Still, the Duke said nothing. Among the servants moving along the walls, one figure went particularly unnoticed. Elara had worked in the Duke's household for 8 months, invisible by design and preference. She carried trays, poured wine, and navigated the dangerous currents of noble gatherings like a shadow no one thought to acknowledge. But she heard every word Varen spoke. Not partially, perfectly. She had spent 3 years in Varen before circumstances forced her south. She knew the language as fluently as her own, knew its rhythms and its cruelties. And listening to the ambassador's venom drip unchallenged into the silence, something inside her pulled tight with fury. Not merely at the insults themselves, but at the calculation behind them. Varen had chosen his weapon deliberately, a language he believed would isolate the Duke, would let him wound without consequence because no one else could call him to account. He was wrong. Elara's hands stilled on the wine decanter she had been refilling. Her gaze shifted to the Duke, searching for any indication he would answer, would defend himself, would refuse to let this stand. But he remained silent, choosing dignity over engagement, control over confrontation. And in that choice, Varen was winning. The ambassador leaned back in his chair, delivering what sounded like a final, casual observation. Several Varendian diplomats in attendance went pale. One actually flinched. Elara understood why. What Varen had just said transcended insult. It was a threat, thinly veiled, suggesting that the Duke's careful treaties might not survive the year if he proved too weak to defend even his own reputation. The room held its breath without knowing why, and Elara made her decision. She did not think about consequences or station or the fact that servants who spoke out of turn could be dismissed without reference. She thought only that someone had to answer, and if the Duke would not, then she would. She stepped forward, not dramatically, just one clear step that brought her into the space between tables. And she spoke in flawless Varendian. Her words were carefully chosen, structured as a polite observation but unmistakably firm in meaning. She suggested that bold words often mask insecurity, and that those who rely on languages others cannot challenge might fear honest confrontation. The effect was instantaneous. Every conversation stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, not with curiosity, but with shock so complete it felt like the air itself had solidified. Because a maid, a nobody, had just done the impossible. Ambassador Varen's expression flickered. Surprise, then calculation, then something harder. He switched to the common tone, his voice carrying easily. How unusual. Tell me, does your master know you possess such unexpected education? Before the Duke could respond, Elara met Varen's gaze directly. Understanding is not unusual, Ambassador. Using it to conceal disrespect might be. Silence crashed down like a fallen chandelier. And Duke Marcus Ashford finally lifted his eyes to look at the maid who had just stepped between him and ruin. Not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. The silence following Elara's words pressed down like a physical weight, and for several heartbeats, no one moved. Then Ambassador Varen laughed, a practiced sound designed to diffuse tension while maintaining superiority. Spirited staff you keep, your grace, he said, still in the common tongue so all could follow. Though perhaps somewhat overstepping. Elara felt the trap closing. By switching languages, Varen had forced the confrontation into public view where her insubordination became the scandal rather than his insults. Servants did not speak unbidden at formal dinners. They certainly did not correct ambassadors. She had made herself the problem. Before she could retreat, the Duke's voice cut through the tension. Miss Elara. She turned to him, heart hammering, expecting dismissal or worse. But his expression remained unreadable. You speak Varendian fluently. Yes, your grace. And you understood the ambassador's earlier observations. Every word, your grace. Something shifted in the Duke's eyes, not anger, but a cold, calculating fury directed entirely away from her. He turned that look on Varen with such precision that even the ambassador's practiced charm faltered. Then perhaps, the Duke said softly, you might translate for our guest what the ambassador has spent the last quarter hour saying, so that we might all appreciate his wit. Varen's face went carefully blank. That seems unnecessary. I insist. The Duke's voice remained quiet, but absolute. Miss Elara, please. Elara's mind raced. She could soften the translation, could protect diplomatic relations, could retreat into propriety. But the Duke had not asked for diplomacy. He had asked for truth. She drew a steady breath and began. She translated each insult precisely, without embellishment, but without mercy. The questioning of the Duke's intelligence, the mockery of his restraint, the suggestion that his authority was inherited rather than earned, the thinly veiled threat regarding the treaties. With each sentence, the atmosphere grew heavier. Guests who had dismissed the earlier tension now understood exactly what had occurred under their noses. Several noble families represented in the room had their own agreements with the duchy. Varen's words implicated them all. By the time Elara finished, Ambassador Varen had lost control of the entire encounter. The Duke let silence settle before speaking again. Ambassador, in my house we value clarity. If there is something to be said, it should be said openly, so all may judge it accordingly. It was a gentle rebuke in words only. In meaning, it was devastating. Varen had been caught using linguistic obscurity as a weapon, and worse, had been exposed by someone he had not considered worth noticing. Your Grace, Varen began, attempting to salvage dignity. I meant no. Of course not. The Duke interrupted smoothly. Words without meaning are harmless, after all. He turned to Elara. Thank you for the clarification. You may return to your duties. Elara curtsied and withdrew, feeling dozens of eyes track her movement. Whispers started the moment she reached the walls, scandalized, curious, calculating. She had just made herself visible in a world that demanded her invisibility. The dinner concluded early. Guests departed with unusual haste, carrying fresh gossip like prizes. By midnight, the estate had emptied except for staff and the few diplomatic envoys staying overnight. Elara was summoning glasses in the servants' pantry when the head steward appeared. Miss Elara, the Duke requires you in his study. Her hand stilled. Now. Immediately. The walk through darkened corridors felt endless. She had defended the Duke's honor, yes, but she had also violated every rule of her station. He could dismiss her without reference, could ensure she never worked in a noble house again. She knocked on the study door. His voice called her in. Duke Ashford stood near the window, his back partially turned. Firelight cast sharp shadows across the books lining the walls. He did not speak. Immediately, letting the silence stretch until her nerves pulled taut. Finally, he turned. Where did you learn Varendian? I lived there for 3 years, Your Grace. Before returning south. Doing what? Working in a merchant household. Teaching their children languages. His eyes narrowed slightly. You speak others? 4 fluently. 3 adequately. And you never mentioned this because? Elara met his gaze carefully. Because maids who speak 7 languages invite questions about why they are maids. The truth landed between them, blunt and undeniable. She had hidden her education deliberately, knowing it would make her seem inappropriate for her position, that it would draw exactly the kind of attention she had spent months avoiding. The Duke studied her for a long moment. You placed yourself at considerable risk tonight. Yes, Your Grace. You made yourself the subject of gossip that will spread through 3 counties by morning. I know. Why? The question was direct, demanding honesty. Elara chose her words carefully. Because what he said was wrong. Because letting it stand unchallenged would have damaged more than your reputation. And because... She hesitated, then finished quietly. Because no one else would. Something flickered across the Duke's expression, not quite gratitude, but something adjacent. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that she had seen what others had missed or chosen to ignore. You understand, he said slowly, that after tonight, you cannot simply return to your previous position. The household will talk. Guests will remember. Your invisibility is gone. I understand. He turned back to the window, hands clasped behind him. I have a proposal. Elara waited, heart pounding, as the Duke measured his next words. My correspondence secretary recently departed for a position abroad, he said. The role requires someone fluent in multiple languages, capable of discretion, and able to navigate diplomatic nuances without explicit instruction. He turned to face her fully. I believe you might suit it. Elara blinked in shock. Your Grace, I'm overqualified to carry wine trays, apparently. His expression remained serious, but something almost like humor touched the edges. The position comes with appropriate quarters, appropriate salary, and appropriate standing within the household. You would work directly with me on sensitive matters. You would attend certain diplomatic functions when linguistic expertise is required. He paused. You would no longer be invisible. The offer was staggering. It was also dangerous. Moving from servant to secretary would invite intense scrutiny, would place her in constant proximity to the Duke himself. Why? She asked quietly. Because tonight you demonstrated judgment, courage, and competence when others demonstrated neither. Because I have been seeking someone I can trust with matters that require both intelligence and discretion. His gaze held her steadily. And because I suspect you have been wasted on wine decanters for quite some time. Elara's throat tightened. She thought of the years she had spent concealing herself, choosing safety over recognition, invisibility over risk. Thought of how exhausting it had been to pretend she understood less than she did, to bite back observations, to remain silent when she could have contributed. I accept, she said. The Duke nodded once. You begin tomorrow. For tonight, get some rest. The household will have questions by morning. They did. By breakfast, every servant knew of her promotion. Reactions ranged from stunned approval to thinly veiled resentment. But the Duke's steward made the transition clear and official, providing her with new quarters, new responsibilities, and access to the private study where the Duke conducted his most sensitive work. The first weeks were challenging. Elara learned quickly that the Duke's restraint concealed relentless standards. He demanded precision in correspondence, absolute discretion in diplomatic matters, and the ability to anticipate needs before he voiced them. But she also discovered that beneath his controlled exterior lived a sharp mind and unexpected humor. He listened when she made suggestions, reconsidered positions when she presented strong arguments, and trusted her judgment in ways that gradually shifted their dynamic from employer and employee to something resembling partnership. 2 months after her promotion, Ambassador Varen returned for a follow-up negotiation. The moment he entered the study and found Elara seated at the secondary desk, reviewing treaty documents, his expression went carefully blank. Miss Elara, he said coolly, I see your circumstances have improved. Ambassador. She inclined her head politely. I trust your journey was pleasant. The Duke entered then, his presence immediately commanding the room. Ambassador Varen, shall we begin? The negotiation that followed was a masterclass in controlled confrontation. Varen attempted his previous tactics, subtle implications, veiled threats, occasional phrases in Varendian clearly meant to test whether Elara's earlier display had been anomaly or ability. Each time, she translated smoothly, rendering his manipulations transparent. By the third attempt, Varen abandoned the strategy entirely. The treaties they finalized that afternoon were more favorable to the duchy than anyone had anticipated. As Varen departed, his parting look at Elara carried grudging respect beneath the irritation. When the door closed, the Duke turned to her. "Well done. He made it easier than expected," Elara said. "Predictable tactics. Still, you handled it perfectly." He paused, then added quietly, "I was right to trust you." Something warm unfurled in Elara's chest at those words. Not merely professional satisfaction, but the deeper recognition that she had found a place where her full self, her intelligence, her languages, her judgment, was not only accepted but valued. Over the following year, her role expanded. She accompanied the Duke to diplomatic functions, advised on treaty language, and gradually became known throughout the region as the Duke's most trusted counselor. Gossip initially questioned the propriety of a former Maid holding such position, but results silenced criticism. Trade agreements flourished, diplomatic relationships strengthened, and Duke Ashford's reputation evolved from that of a cold, controlled tactician to a leader wise enough to recognize ability regardless of origin. One evening, reviewing correspondence in the study they now shared comfortably, the Duke set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Speaking that night, Elara considered the question. She thought about the safety of invisibility she had surrendered, the risks she had accepted, the scrutiny she now navigated daily. "No," she said finally. "I regret the years I spent silent before it." The Duke smiled, a real one, unguarded in a way few ever witnessed. "Then we both learned something valuable that evening." "What did you learn, Your Grace?" "That strength is not always quiet," he said, "and that the most valuable voices are sometimes the ones we almost overlook." Outside, spring rain began to fall softly against the windows, washing the estate clean. And inside the study, in the warm circle of lamplight, a Duke and his counselor returned to their work, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not romance, though the household occasionally whispered hopefully. Something rarer, true recognition, freely given across an impossible divide. And in a world built on hierarchy and appearances, that recognition was worth more than all the treaties they would ever negotiate. Years later, when Elara herself became the duchy's official ambassador of languages, she would think back to that dinner party often, to the moment she chose truth over safety, visibility over survival. It remained the best decision she had ever made, not because it elevated her station, though it had, but because it had finally allowed her to stop hiding and start living as herself, fully and without apology. And in Duke Ashford's household, where competence was rewarded and merit recognized, that was worth everything.